Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to you all, wherever you are around the world. And welcome to this third ESG Exchange Tech Talk. I'm just going to give people another minute or so to log on, and then we'll resume formally. In the meantime, please feel free to holler on chat and just say welcome to each other and say where you're from and so forth. And we'll kick off in a minute or so. Very good. So we're at 125 people, which I think is great, given the month of August and the fact that the Northern Hemisphere have and mostly on the beach, depending on where they are. They're in Ireland, they're freezing. If they're in the rest of Europe, they're boiling. I would like to welcome you all to this, our third ESG Tech Talk with the ESG Exchange. And the thematic that we're running for the first few Tech Talks is clearly around materiality. All of our Tech Talks are available to watch on demand. You simply have to go to the esgexchange.org, go to events, and you can go to past events, and you can pick up and watch the discussions we've had then. In June, our discussion with GRI and Veronica Poole focused on materiality from the perspective of from impacts to risks and opportunities. In July, we had Sue Lloyd from ISB, Rod Carr, Jared Krumpelman from ABN AMRO, and the discussion there was on materiality, information required for investor decision making. This conversation, again on materiality, the discussion is around optimizing performance. And for that reason, we needed to invite the people who have, at this really super global level, taken on board the obligation, the mantra of helping us to understand materiality from the capital markets perspective, but impacts as well. So we have Fabienne from the UNDP. I'll go through the introductions in a moment, the formal profiles in a moment. Jeremy Nicholls, also UNDP, but an ambassador in the Cabals Coalition. He and I work together as commissioners. He is my boss in the Value Commission, where we have 40-odd commissioners from around the world, and we'll tell you a bit more about that later. And Lourdes, Montenegro from the World Benchmarking Alliance. And this event, as you'll have seen, is kindly sponsored by the company that I work for, which is Archer Integrated Risk Management. Before I get into the detail, let's just share just a minute or two on the ESG Exchange. And maybe, Carolyn, you might share your screen. And just to remind people why we've created the ESG Exchange, what we're here to do. And in the About Us page, you will see that the problem that we're striving to solve, and our founding patron here, Professor Mervyn King, former chair of GRI, IIRC, and the person largely responsible for the consolidation that took place within ISB, given his influence. But the problem we're seeking to solve in the ESG Exchange is the fact that there aren't enough experts to go around in the world to help organizations move their sustainability dials, as it were. That's the problem we're solving. Our purpose, therefore, is to spread the very thin amount, small amount of expertise that exists globally and make it freely available on a digital platform, having reimagined how it is we can perform the miracle of the loaves and fishes, bringing a small amount of information, of expertise to the masses. Our vision is of common principles, common approaches, common methods of practice, in such that all organizations are doing, broadly speaking, the same thing, given the importance of value chains in particular, and getting all sustainability needles to move. And then our ambition. It's our ambition, or between now and 2030, to bring 10 million people through sustainability fundamentals in the ESG Exchange. Because if we don't succeed in doing that, 10 million directors and managers from 10,000 global organizations, If we don't succeed in our mission, then quite frankly, we will not have made a contribution, a worthwhile contribution that is so desperately needed in the context of the planet and societies. So we're delighted to have our guest speakers here this morning, and now for the, as it were, the formal introductions. Fab is director of SDG Impact, the UN's flagship initiative in its Sustainable Finance Hub. SDG Impact was established in 2019 by the UN to accelerate the mobilization of private capital towards sustainable development and the achievement of sustainable development goals by 2030. Fab is a member of the Australian Advisory Board on Impact Investing, and in 2019 and 2020, she co-chaired the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiatives Working Group on Making Better Decisions. Fab previously was also worked in organizations like S&P Global and in S&P Global in global ratings. Jeremy Nicholls. Jeremy is the assurance framework lead in the UNDP SDG Impact Standards and is an ambassador for the Capitals Coalition, which is a global collaboration to integrate sustainability into business decision making. Jeremy co-chairs the Value Commission, and the purpose of the Value Commission is to bring in the next 2 or 3 years or so, make available to the world an open access database that will help our organizations put monetary values on non-financial impacts. He's also a member of A4S, this is the Accounting for Sustainability, Prince of Wales Trust, and he's on the expert panel there and a member of GRI's Due Process Oversight Committee. Jeremy originally qualified as a chartered accountant, and formerly he was a director, finance director, for example, of Tasmania Railways, and is one of the founders and CEO of the SVI. Lourdes, from the World Benchmarking Alliance, is director of research and digitalization there, and she leads in the research and digitalization strategy for the organization to deliver globally inclusive frameworks, quality data, and impactful insights across all benchmarks. Previously, Lourdes led the strategy for WBA's digital sector transformation and developing a framework there for digital inclusion benchmarking that will allow 200 of the world's most influential digital technology companies. Before joining the WBA, Lourdes worked as an economist at the Statistics Division of the UN's International Telecommunication Union. Myself, my day job, I'm working in a company called Archer IRM, where I'm the Global Director for Risk and Sustainability. Outside of Archer, I am the chair of the ESG Exchange Technical Committee, which is overseeing the production of how-to playbooks, which we will begin to launch at COP28. I'm also a member of Jeremy's Value Commission, along with 40 other commissioners, and very heavily invested in ISO, where I'm one of, for example, of the 7 editors of ISO 37000, governance of organizations, convener of the strategy group for that part of ISO that's separately responsible for 31,000 risk management. So that's it with the introductions. Now for the meat in the sandwich. Our topic here, our approach here, is to bring to the surface what matters most in the context of our discussion topic, materiality, optimizing performance. What matters most, what are the challenges, and what are the insights that our panelists can bring to you all. So my first question would be to you, Fab. And again, in the context of materiality, optimizing performance, that's the lens we're taking in this Tech Talk, this third session. What does sustainability performance mean? And how is it different to sustainability reporting? What's the difference between reporting on the one hand and performance? Fab.
Thank you. Well, I think sustainability performance has a couple of elements to it. Firstly, how effective management are in identifying and managing the impacts that the organisation has on people and planet. So really looking at that from the perspective of the overall changes in aspects in, I guess, UN talk, aspects of wellbeing, social and environmental aspects of wellbeing experienced by people and planet that are caused by the organisation through its decisions and activities, whether they're in their operations, supply and value chains, or through their business relationships. And importantly, from a performance perspective, relative to thresholds of minimum expected performance. So things like our Paris commitments, is our performance from a climate emissions perspective on track to bring us to net zero by 2050, or keep our fair share of contributions to below 1.5 degrees. Are we contributing to performance that helps to actually take performance of other measures above the targets that are set in the SDG targets, for instance. The other element of sustainability performance is then how well organisations manage the social and environmental factors that impact their own business performance, so the risks and opportunities. And I think, that's important. It's not just a risk management exercise. Increasingly, as we've got many more, sustainability related megatrends, there's lots of opportunities for business to be leaning into those trends to look for future business opportunities and capitalising on those. So how good is it at actually identifying those and leaning into those and creating value and future value for the organisation, and potentially improving growth opportunities, but also the resilience of the organisation as well over time. Sustainability reporting, it would be nice if sustainability reporting was a reflection of the effectiveness of management's decisions in that regard. But as we know, it's on a journey and it's probably not there yet. And I think that, one of the major issues we have at the moment, which is obviously, starting to be, starting to look like it will be different in the future, is that sustainability reporting is voluntary and is often done in a way that probably isn't as comprehensive or complete as we would like. And there tends to be a focus on reporting of positive intended outcomes, not necessarily always the most material impacts. Perhaps, maybe if we were being kind, perhaps a bias towards positive impacts and less so on the negative impact side. So that's, so that's the first thing. I think that from a materiality perspective, the really, important thing is, in terms of important impacts, as they're experienced by the stakeholders that are affected or by the organisation, are we actually reporting, all important issues, the really material things? And probably with some of the ways that people and organisations look at materiality, there's a high likelihood that some of those more important impacts are being filtered out, particularly when you apply a financial materiality lens. You might be missing out on those impacts on people and planet, while capturing the dependencies maybe a little bit better. I think that one of the other challenges we have with materiality is that increasingly, in terms of overall risk for the system as a whole, systemic risk is actually becoming a much bigger proportion of total risk because of some of these major changes like climate change and biodiversity loss and all of these things that are starting to impact at a macro level. But from a reporting perspective, we're still very focused on that idiosyncratic or company-specific identification of risks, which means that we're probably not capturing some of the risks that may not be material at a company level, but when we aggregate them up at the system level, they're very material. So that's another shortcoming.
Okay.
And I think, we all know that there's a lot of discussion going on around, scope 1, 2 and 3. So a lot of reporting at the moment, particularly on the emissions side, might capture scope 1 and 2 if you're lucky, but not scope 3 emissions through, through the value chain. And, that's often where a lot of the impacts are being felt. So that's not making it through into the reporting either. Then, I think one of the other aspects that, that we have a challenge with is that the metrics that we choose to report to are often activity or output metrics, not impact or outcome metrics. and perhaps they're not good enough proxies for the impacts that we're trying to measure. So, users of that information might be basing decisions on those metrics, but they're not necessarily giving us a really good idea about what the impact as it's experienced by stakeholders is actually being felt. So, I think I'll leave it there. Also, I think the other thing which I mentioned in the opening is just that necessity for users for the information to be useful, and for it to be useful, we need to report it in context. So, we see a lot of reporting, relative, reductions or increases, but we don't necessarily have a good idea of the performance relative to what our baseline was, where we started from, the performance relative to the threshold that we need to meet, and whether we're making change at a pace that's fast enough. And, from our targets, how are we going relative to our targets, and were our targets ambitious enough in that regard?
So that's a lot there for people to onboard, particularly people that are not kind of very, very familiar with this whole topic of ESG. And Jeremy, you're an accountant, financial person.
Once upon a time.
I mean, well, you're okay now, you tell me.
There's one in every group.
There's one indeed, and there needs to be. When we look at it, there seems to be a trend where, this whole ESG thing has been driven by investors, and there seems to be, in shorthand terms, using ESG data, which the output of which informs better decision making to make it more sustainable, is the idea. And investors are using ESG data as kind of a proxy, it seems, for the likelihood of better performance going forward. So, Jeremy, in the context, and maybe narrowing the focus a bit, the people that I work with day in, day out in Archer, they're there to run businesses, and they primarily are there to service all their stakeholders, but historically, primarily, they're investors. So using that as a kind of a placeholder at a level, how do we assess expected performance from kind of the impact kind of, side of the pendulum swing to business performance on the other, that kind of impact to business? How are they going to assess expected performance particularly?
Well, I think we'll probably come back to part of that. So I'll just start with the expected performance piece, because you get the focus on that then. Expected performance starts with targets. And even with having targets, we've noticed that can sometimes be interpreted as a kind of general set of words. We mean quantified targets when we say that, smart. We mean targets for expected positive and negative impacts that different groups are going to be experiencing. So you not just any old quantified targets then, but you have to have some process of understanding that. But even then, targets, I mean, it's quite easy to have a target that's a bit better than last year, and no one will question it. And you can achieve that target, but we're not going to shift the needle unless the targets are therefore ambitious. And so a lot of our work has been then saying, well, what do we actually mean by ambitious? We have to refer that to need. We have to refer that to stakeholder expectations. And we have to move away from doing a little bit more than we did last year, or even benchmarking ourselves with peers, because at the moment, it would seem clear that our levels of targeting and performance are not cumulatively enough to shift some of the needles. And the recent SDG report has shown that many of those are moving in the wrong direction, let alone the right. So we need to raise the bar. And the best example, the best kind of indication of whether those targets are ambitious within an organization is the level of argument that's happening when they're being set. If you present your targets to the board and they go, that's fine, off you go, they're probably not ambitious enough. If the board set them by themselves and the management team leave in a panic because they're unachievable, they're probably overambitious. But somewhere in that debate, which is what you'd expect to see in any financial situation. So with the analogy with finances, when you're setting your annual targets for next year, there's always an argument going on between a bit higher, please, that's not possible until you get something achievable. But we have a backstop in finance for those targets as well to make them ambitious. There's an accountability framework. And if in the end businesses are not setting ambitious targets, then competition will see the end. You know, the kind of reality of creative destruction is that your feet are held in the fire, and you have to make those targets ambitious. Now in sustainability, we don't quite have that. And the classic, I think not classic, the most stark example for me is gender, because at current rates of change, we will not achieve gender equality for another 250 or so years. And that is not an ambitious target. And if you were to ask, I suspect, those experiencing the consequences of gender inequality, how fast they wanted that to happen as a target, it would be somewhat quicker than 250 years. And so if you were to set your targets by reference to the groups expecting them, you might find that 250 years suddenly becomes a month or so, and we better all get on with it.
Cool. Wow. I mean, I like your point about, I'm just mindful of in my own organization, you know, so we've established our baseline. We go to SBTI and we say, oh, wow, okay, so we've got 10 years now, the longest at the time we're giving ourselves, to get a 54.6% reduction. And given that nearly all of our stuff is in scope 3, that's tough.
That's a minimum. So we would understand that as a threshold. So you allocate that target across enterprises, you divide it by the number of years you've got, and that gives you your minimum performance.
Yeah.
Given that most organizations not going to be doing that, we've got to do substantively better than that.
And for us, our biggest problem is the fact that there's only so much influence you have on your suppliers, but the deep behavioral changes internally in procurement and also anyway. So on to the Lourdes, the WBA, the World Benchmarking Alliance. What are you seeing in the WBA in terms of how are people adopting this multi-stakeholder approach to this whole broad problem of materiality? Because life was easy when we only had one stakeholder the business world largely. It only had one stakeholder to really consider, and that was the investor. But we've now gone past that. Shareholder capitalism is no longer here. It's kind of stakeholder capitalism. But how are organizations taking this multi-stakeholder approach to the problem of materiality?
The TLDR of it, it's still an uphill battle. It's still not there. It's still at the initial stages of that conversation. We were in Mexico recently for our Allies Assembly. So the WBA, we don't necessarily constrain ourselves to the idea of materiality. We engage with the concept, but that's not what we do. What we do is essentially to measure and incentivize and ensure that companies are held accountable for their contribution towards sustainable development broadly. And to do that, you need to view it from a systemic perspective and not an arbitrary perspective. So I was in Mexico recently for our Allies Assembly, and we had some companies invited. We had a Coca-Cola FEMSA, for example, a cement company. And to them, we were quite surprised. To them, it was new that there was a multi-stakeholder audience, and they were suddenly confronted with, from investors like Morgan Stanley, who was there, to NGOs like Oxfam, and it was quite a challenge, and they were like discombobulated, you know, by the multi-stakeholder nature of it. In some jurisdictions, they've gotten used to the multi-stakeholder nature of their engagements, but it's still quite a struggle. And in some way, as a company, you're probably wondering, who's the stakeholder that I engage with? I've actually participated in some of these materiality assessments. I get interviewed by companies on, you know, what is material to them or not. And I look at the list of who they interview, and it's quite arbitrary. Like, and so you end up with an arbitrary set of issues that suddenly become material to your company. And that's why we often hear an appreciation for the work that we do, because it is a holistic roadmap of it's not an arbitrary compilation of this is what the stakeholder says. And that is why we always put all stakeholders together, because you need to horse trade with each other. You need to negotiate. This stakeholder wants meatless protein, and this stakeholder wants food security. Okay, who of you will win? So it's it's still really not there. It's still quite a struggle. And just reflecting on your idea of the performance, because I found it a very interesting concept, sustainability performance with respect to reporting. That's what we hope to bridge, actually, that we can look at the data of what is actually disclosed and try to see where, can we make inferences around performance. So our climate benchmark looks at is there a scientifically credible transition plan? And that's easier said than done. You need to start with an overall carbon budget, which is distributed across industries, and you need to see whether the transition plans of companies are actually within that budget, and not exceeding that budget. So it's a very interesting and an open challenge. I mean, there are a lot of what do you call that, company encounters that I've had, which led me to reflect on what that means for the company at the business model level, because sustainability is more than just climate. It's also human relationships. It's also inequality more broadly, and sometimes we forget that SDG number 1 is no poverty. So, for example, I've had opportunity to visit Xiaomi in China once. And I went to see, I had a factory tour and everything. And then they, one of their VPs presented their strategy, and they said, well, their strategy was to produce the highest quality goods at the lowest prices. I said, if you think about it in the frame of technology access for all, that's great for people in Africa, people in Latin America, for the developing world. They get cheap access. But on the other side of that, is that they're thinking, okay, then how do we make money? So then we're going to collect data. And therefore you run into digital rights issues and privacy issues. And these are nuanced and complicated issues.
Yeah. And, for people that are on the call, because it's happening all the time when we get questions and so forth and feedback, people feel, even the organizations that have been reporting GRI for the last 10, 20 years, in the context of the regulatory framework that we're now in, this whole challenge is really quite overwhelming. So for people on the call, that feel a bit overwhelmed and at their wits' end, don't be concerned, because effectively what we're trying to do, we, the world, everybody, not just us in the ESG exchange, is do in a handful of years what took decades to do in the area, for example, of financial accounting standardization and so forth, to getting to the point where information was comparable and relatable and so forth. Carolyn, I wonder if you could maybe throw up our first poll, and we would give people maybe 3 or 4 seconds just to consider the poll. Do you understand the difference between reporting sustainability performance and reporting sustainability generally? We're just going to give you what's your instinct tell you? And we'll throw up the results when Carolyn has them. I'm really impressed with our numbers. We have, I think, 500 and something registrants, and we have almost just over 50%, or almost 50% in attendance, which in Zoom stats terms is quite good. Ordinarily it's 25, 30%. So clearly it reflects the rock stars we have as panelists here on our call. So Carolyn, can you share the results there so I can move on to the next round of questions? Here we go. Okay. Any top of head? I'm just going to take one observation from anybody who's first out to click the unmute button to this result here. Any top of mind observations here? Jeremy, you're unmuted.
Well, it's a broad mix there, isn't it? And I think it is quite a shift of thinking when we start talking about performance materiality. In finance, you get both. We get some kind of information about the economic resources that a company has, its balance sheet, which is an equivalent to some extent of the non-owned assets that a company has been using, what some call its dependencies. and the other obligations that it might have created for its business model. But we don't tend to get the flip side of that, which is a profit and loss account in sustainability. So when impact profit and loss, if you want. Now, there are a couple of companies that are doing that, but the logic of the UNDP standards is that if you apply those, you would be able to create something along those lines. And so that's quite a gap and quite a big shift. So I'm not surprised there's quite a mix of perspectives from the yes, no, and don't knows in that response.
Okay, thank you for that, Jeremy. And again, sticking with our discussion topic, materiality, optimizing performance, and Fab, back to you. What are sustainability informed decisions, and what does that mean for materiality? Because, you know, it's very hard to measure the quality of a decision until maybe afterwards when you see the results of it. But, you know, so what are sustainability informed decisions, and what does this mean for materiality?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, I think you hit on a key point there that, you know, sustainability informed decisions are decisions we make with a forward-looking lens, and you know, reporting is something that we do after the fact to see how we did and whether or not we made the right choices, and you know, hopefully learn from that in some shape or form. You know, I find in some respects the concept of materiality is really a reporting, you know, a reporting concept. And I wonder if, you know, in terms of decision making, it's better not to actually think in terms of materiality and leave the materiality assessment to when you need to report to decide whether, you know, what you're going to report to which stakeholders. Because I think there's a lot of complexity in materiality, and it starts to become much more straightforward from a decision making perspective if you think about things in a much more straightforward manner about, well, what impacts are important to our stakeholders, and what impacts or dependencies are important in terms of their effect on our business. So, you know, really looking at trying to identify those things and manage them well. And, you know, from our perspective, I think, you know, sustainability informed decisions are ones where we collect and use impact data to create insights that then helps us generate choices and then make options between those choices, and, you know, manage the trade-offs effectively. And think about that also, you know, in terms of the risks, you know, risks that the impacts won't be experienced as we expect them, you know, and that's risks to the organisation, but also risks to the stakeholders that experience the effects of the organisation's decisions and activities. I think I think what that also implies then in terms of being able to make those choices is that we actually need to be able to value those options so that we can compare them and choose between them. And you know, from an impact perspective, if we're doing that well, we're actually including the input from stakeholders in determining what those relative values are. So it's not just you know, the organisation or accountants coming up with that. We're really, you know, engaging with the stakeholders that are affected by those decisions, and getting their perspectives on the relative value of those choices, and then factoring that into our process to decide what's important. I think that by doing it that way, we're much more likely to actually see around corners and anticipate risks and opportunities a lot better. Whereas if we try and do this from a reporting perspective back and say, okay, well, these are the things that are material, and we're going to manage those, particularly if there's deficiencies in how we're calculating materiality, or we're coming at it from an investor lens and filtering out things that we don't think are financially material yet. Remembering that financial reporting does have a rather short-term focus, even though we say we're including long-term effects. Often we discount those back to an extent that they become immaterial in the shorter term from a reporting perspective. I think we're in a far better position to, you know, to identify the right things and manage them effectively. And I think it's important because when we think about these things at the moment, a lot of organisations may think that these aren't things that are important for the value of the organisation or for investors. increasingly because, we're hitting some of the tipping points for some of these, big systems that we operate within, they're effectively not achieving the SDGs, not achieving the overall climate emissions reductions that are being set, are systemic risks for the business, for businesses generally. I think that, increasingly, we're becoming constrained and reliant on actually achieving some of these outcomes to maintain healthy, ecological and social ecosystems that, we all rely upon to actually, live, work, produce, sell, invest. So, if we don't actually start taking care of those systems, that's going to start having a much more negative impact on the potential for future businesses, increased risks, lower growth opportunities. And, we're already experiencing that, but we sort of feel it's outside our control. So we don't, we explain it away. So, a lot of businesses are already feeling the effects of natural disasters, of, we all felt the effects of, of the pandemic, and, with, increased temperature changes, the potential for those sorts of things to happen more frequently in the future, is a distinct possibility. So how do we actually, all invest in maintaining those healthy ecosystems so that we can maximise the potential for, for growth and resilience in the future?
Cool. And just in the context, sustainability and where we are from a planetary, societal perspective, we need to make decisions. And there isn't all that much data from the past that we can use to help inform us about what the future might look like. So what does a good decision look like? Really, that's the honors question here, isn't it? So Jeremy, how do we assess decision-making effectiveness? How do you do that in a way, in a meaningful way at a board level and at the executive level, right down through the decision-making levels in an organization? How do we do that? Decision-making effectiveness.
The first point, I think, is that that sustainability is already embedded in decisions. It's just generally negative impacts that follow from that, and we haven't recognized them or accounted for them. So it's not that it's not happening. So when we say we're embedding sustainability in decision making, we're saying, let's start making those consequences transparent when we make those decisions, and then start worrying about them. And so it's a recognition that there are trade-offs happening in decisions all the time. And that's not between financial and non-financial consequences. It's between sustainability areas, so you are trading off increasing equality or reducing poverty against some other area. Now that's happening pretty much all the time, but it's not transparent. And so the first thing you want to see if you're assessing that is, has an organization started to realize that and put it on the table? Have we said, we're going to make this decision. We think it has some positive consequences. Isn't that great? But we realize there's some negative ones as well, because that puts you, and I've been in this situation, it's a very uncomfortable decision where you go, we think that's still good to go despite those negative consequences. We think the positives outweigh the negatives. And who are we in the end to say that? So the first step is to boldly do that. The second one is to go and say, well, maybe we ought to have asked the people who experience those negatives what they think about all that. And so the assessment of a good decision starts with that recognition, putting it on the table, starting to record it, write those down, starting to base that trade-off on some other information to support it, actually coming from your stakeholders, starting to ask the organization what actually they're doing about those negatives. Did they go and check whether the people are experiencing them are happy to do that, or they're trying to minimize them, or there's a level above which they wouldn't go, or they might even be considering compensating for those negatives. But to pretend that they're not there and happening with every decision is the scary bit. And the relation again to finance is back to that. It's happening in finance all the time. We think the income we're going to get exceeds the costs, so we're going to go away and do it. We're making that trade-off, and that might be a trade-off between let's pay our suppliers a little bit more and our employees a little bit less. So we're making those trade-offs, and we hope that in the end of the year, all those decisions will end up with more income than expenditure. So when we're making all these decisions about embedding sustainability, we bring those to the fore, we make them transparent, and we hope that at the end of the year, the positives have outweighed the negatives, and we have got plans to reduce those negatives super fast and compensate for them where appropriate and possible. So that's the first bit on good decisions. But the second bit, and it goes back to what we've been saying a bit around forward looking, is that the reporting journey has taken us all the way down, collecting information and reporting it, rather than starting from, we have some information already, what insights can we get from that information? Because that will give us ideas about how we might be able to increase the impact we're having today, right now. And the effectiveness then is some assessments of the organization's ability to generate insights, to use the data it's got to increase that data. The more data you get, you will get an exponential increase in the number of insights. And every time you get an insight, you might be able to drive an option to increase your impact, and then you can make a decision. And this is inherently a forward-looking and creative and exciting way of thinking about this, because you're now bringing human creativity to the challenge of, actually, we can do something better than we're doing now, and we can understand the trade-offs on it, and we don't have to have super-duper data that we're always referring to as that's the challenge. It flips it on its head somewhat.
So just you said a couple of things, Jeremy. They're just I'm conscious of this rite of passage that we're going through in the world, from kind of short-termism to long-termism. Short-termism in terms of short financial gain, just thinking about the shareholder, to long-termism, which is the multi-stakeholder kind of perspective. Bearing in mind also that people might not agree with me, but I've got the simple point of view that ESG is just old risk management wine in a new bottle, and it's being used by investors as a proxy for working out the likelihood of the sustainable performance of companies over time. So over the longer term specifically. So Lourdes, from your perspective and the work you're doing in the WBA, what are you guys saying in your benchmarking work in the area of materiality? How are, I don't know, was it you or Fab that made reference to sometimes what appears like an arbitrary approach to understanding who are our stakeholders and their influences on our decisions? But you know, in your benchmarking work in the area of materiality, how are companies engaging with their stakeholders? What can you see at the moment in that regard?
You know, frankly, coming as an outsider to this space, because I never really, came in as an ESG professional. I was an economist, an environmental economist, a technology policy specialist. The first question I was asked was, if people want to sound clever and they want to talk to me, they'll start spouting off all sorts of materiality questions. And I found it really, really a bit entertaining. But we know that there are different types of materiality concepts out there, from single, double materiality. And I mean, if you say that companies who are performing best on our benchmarks are those who are focused on impact, focused on performance, maybe you can say they are engaged in the concept of double materiality more than just single materiality. Maybe we could say that the top performers are that way. But there could still be some confusion. Let me give a very specific example, because we live in a world of abstractions. We have empirical data. I'll give an example: Taiwan Cement. Okay, think of this company earns $3 billion annually US dollars. 67% of it is from cement. You would think that their starting point is to, as a basic materials company, their starting point would be to look at all their dependencies on resources and nature. We check, don't find any evidence, it's not there. When you talk about decisions, you look at their board of directors. It's interesting that they actually disclose types of training that their board of directors get. And you know what kind of training that they get? ESG from a foreign investor's perspective. These are the types of seminars that they actually join. It's fascinating and entertaining to look at this data. Yet there's no skills matrix that shows what is their training background, what is their sustainability expertise for a company that is indeed involved in basic materials, right? And the way they talk about their impact on biodiversity, we know biodiversity is one of the key tipping points, right? That might push human civilization to the edge. And the main driver of that is ecosystem conversion. And therefore, as a basic materials company, then you look at, okay, what are you doing around ecosystem conversion? Fascinatingly enough, this company has a commitment for zero ecosystem conversion, at least for the land ecosystems. No deforestation. And then you start asking questions. Why is that? Is it is it just for Taiwan? Does it include their mainland China operations? They don't really disclose where are the regions in the world where they get their materials from. So it's hard to assess what is the credibility of this, zero conversion commitment. And then there's a study from the National Taiwan University for one of their quarries, limestone quarries, that says that there was $108 million Taiwan dollars of lost ecosystem services. And when confronted by that study, then the company goes in and says, we're gonna pay 5.8 million annually to the community, and we're gonna support this and that and that. So, but these are all, shall we say, arbitrary kind of like actions that are not really holistically strategic, reasoning from first principles, looking at, okay, what are we as a company? What are we dependent on? So it's that's what we're seeing. It's really fascinating sort of schizophrenia that is existing out there. We see that everywhere, like even in the digital sector. Like I've had like a data center come up to us and complain why they are held accountable for child online protection. And we said, my God, you saved the data for child porn. Like, how can you not be responsible for child online protection? So all these things, needs to have a holistic perspective. That's what's missing. Okay,
so I mean that's I'm conscious because I work so closely with large organizations in my prior life, prior to Archer, and now in particular now, and big behemoth organizations. They're faced with a tsunami of data, but with just tiny bits of actionable information. And in truth, we probably all should have been having this conversation 20 years ago, but where was the appetite? And then the whole thing of holistic systems decision-making, that's when you look at board agendas and the board guidance over 12 months, it's just so tough. Yeah, with companies, best endeavors, and it's tough because we're changing different approach to decision making and so forth. Carolyn, it's time for our next poll question. I wonder if you could share it with us there. And I'm conscious now of time as well. We're just less than 15 minutes to the top of the hour, and I want to quickly get to our last question, which is a pretty juicy one in my humble opinion. How to use materiality to create insights and inform decisions at different levels, from business to investor. Do you understand this? Yes? No? We think so. And it's okay to say we think we do, because the reality is that the world is on a journey. From the boardroom to the storeroom, everyone is having to change their mindset, their approach, their metrics, the type of data. Is a decision useful? Is it actionable, more to the point? I mean, a lot of people don't realize how compressed board agendas are over a 12-month period, and the limited time they have for deep dives on stuff. And then the super compression on management. Do we have results yet? Caroline? Yes, here we go. Okay. We think we do understand how to use materiality to create insights. The results are clearer than the previous results. I'm actually not going to ask for a comment because I want to move on to my next question. Please forgive me because I'm conscious of time. Third and last question. Again, materiality, performance, optimizing performance. Fab. What are the consequences of low sustainability performance or high sustainability performance? What are those consequences? What's your observation on that?
So I think firstly, in terms of you know, high or low. We need to think high or low to what. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, at the moment when we, you know, when we look at performance, we're looking relative to where we were last year. And as Jeremy said, you know, if last year was, you know, we were really negative, and, you know, maybe we're looking against peers, and, you know, the whole sector isn't performing pretty well, doing a little bit better to compared to last year isn't enough. So, you know, we really look at sustainability performance relative to the thresholds that we need to achieve, and, you know, and the I guess the acceptable and you know, norms that have been actually established through things like the Paris, you know, the Paris agreements and the SDG targets. So that's the first thing. Then I think in terms of the consequences of high or low performance, you know, there's two levels, right? There's the system level, and then there's the organisation level. So, you know, at a system level, you know, when you look at some of the systems and the you know, the stress some of these ecosystems are under, you know, some of the consequences of low sustainability performance, we're not being catastrophic when we say that they're existential. You know, I was talking with an insurance company a few weeks ago, and they said, well, at 3 degrees, there is no global insurance sector. And that's fairly mind-boggling when you look at our current pathway, right? So, and our current performance. So, you know, so there is that broader element in terms of the entire system, that if we don't all play our part in you know, protecting that global commons, that will have an impact on, you know, on everyone to the negative. Then I think at the organisational level, there's also that element that, you know, sustainability related factors are becoming more visible, more front of mind. So organisations that aren't performing well, or are potentially reporting things that then, you know, are shown to be greenwashing, will get penalised for that, and increasingly so, I expect. So, you know, the consequences of low performance at an individual organisation level relative to, you know, peers and other organisations that are increasingly going to be, you know, trying to address some of these factors, and investors that are going to be looking at them more, customers who are making decisions more and more based on sustainability credentials, talent who wants to work for organisations that are purpose-driven and are doing this well, multiple implications for organisations that don't perform well. On the high side, obviously, there's the benefit of actually, you know, all contributing a fair share to actually achieving these societal and planetary outcomes that mean that we can all have a prosperous and better future. And from a business perspective, increasingly, you know, opportunities to manage risks better, make the organisation more resilient to future shocks. And identify potential growth opportunities and be first movers there and capitalise on those by actually really understanding what some of these sustainability related mega trends mean in terms of where future demand is going to be and future opportunities for the business to grow into or pivot into away from activities that are less sustainable.
Wow. So much being said by each of you there, and just, you know, I think the word systems and holistic, it must have, you know, between the three of you, those words must have, I don't know, I wasn't doing a count, but maybe been mentioned 8 or 10 times. And the reality is, from a decision-making perspective, a systems-based decision falls into the very hard to do bucket. It's not a yes, no. And I'm also conscious of, I heard somewhere recently where I think insurance company number 1 and insurance company number 4 in California, which is one of the world's largest economies, have both announced very recently they're no longer writing home insurance. So there's an example of physical impact arriving today to business decisions. Jeremy, and I'm conscious of time just now, but got to run very fast for Jeremy, you, and there's a last question. What's all this mean for material information, or particularly what's it all mean for assurance? Can you tell me in your view?
Okay, I'm going to quickly then. I just want to go back quickly on the short-term, long-term debate that we had in there.
Okay.
We've got 7 years till the SDG targets first to meet. We're already breaching planetary thresholds and social thresholds. None of these are long-term issues. We have to embed all these decisions now. What it means for material information is Firstly, you said something a bit earlier about it took the financial sector ages to get comparable information. Comparability in financial accounting is an enhancing characteristic. It is not a required characteristic. Comparability comes from the process of having a common unit, which is valuation. And if you're doing trade-offs in your decision making and you want to make that transparent, you will have to have valuation happening. So let's not get hung up on indicators if we are doing this from a decision making perspective, and let's start thinking about valuing and quantifying the trade-offs. It also means, and this is another really big, weird difference with the world, how this works in finance. In finance, if you buy a pencil, which you now own, which costs you a few cents, which works, you account for that pencil. You account for it because it's in scope, and you account. Now, the problem with sustainability at the moment is that you do a pre-assessment of materiality. You would not account for those pencils because they're just full. This is a fundamental difference. In finance, we're talking about relevant information first, and then the risk of something missing out. It's relevant because it helps people make better decisions. And that accumulates across all those little bits being added up. And if you swap pencils for people's well-being, and you want to start embedding decision-making to enhance well-being, you need to account for the equivalent of pencils. Very small changes to people's well-being are cumulatively as important as very big changes will be. And that seems to me sort of quite a weird thing. And as you know, I use the pencil analogy because it just is. So that's a different type of information, and we're not getting hung up on indicators. And then the assurance, what that means for assurance would preferably be that we were assuring the effectiveness of decision-making as well, the stewardship that managements have. And that is in part why we developed our standards, because that doesn't exist as a report, as a kind of thinking process in order to be able to assure it. And it's what our assurance process is attempting to do, would be to assure the organization's decision-making processes against that aim of contributing to sustainability at the rate we need and stakeholders expect. And I'm glad you mentioned ISOs at the beginning, because I'm also, as you know, a big fan and involved in the ISO world. And we are currently working with ISO to turn our SDG Impact standards into a management standard 52001, which will hopefully start to deal with some of the issues that Lourdes raised about arbitrary approaches to stakeholder engagement and then not listening to them after you have, and start to contribute to getting some understanding of competencies. I spent 3 years being an accountant, and then had to go 3 years of proving that I had experience in all the right areas before I could go and do anything. And I think use that as a benchmark. We've got a way to go.
The last question for a lot of people on the call here, on the Zoom meeting, might be the most important question. I'm sorry, Lourdes, you've only got 3 minutes to answer it, because it's all to do with what's in this for me. Thinking of CS3G coming out now in Europe, focusing on director duty of care. So, Lourdes, how are companies likely, in your view, to be held to account? And what are the biggest gaps that they need to try and fill?
I think in the end, when there's a lack of voluntary accountability, companies holding themselves to a certain level of standard, measuring their performance in an honest way and telling people about it, at some point the state steps in, and that's probably needed. That's what's missing. Governments, the international government system as well, stepping in and saying, no, we need this. So there are some gaps around that, and eventually that will come to fruition. So it's heading there. We've seen it in human rights. Now it's mandatory human rights due diligence. It moved from voluntary to mandatory human rights due diligence. But we're also seeing some progress, in our Ethical AI Collective Impact Coalition, a multi-stakeholder coalition with lots of investors, but also civil society. They were able to push the boundaries from 14 companies originally who committed to follow ethical AI principles. Now there are 40, more than 40 companies doing it, and that's growing. And that's the power, of collective action. So there's hope. There's hope. We're getting there. I think that's the message.
Everybody, we're at the top of the hour. Please give a virtual clap to 3 outstanding speakers, 3 outstanding panelists. Please keep an eye out. COP28, you'll begin to see emergence of the first iterations of our how-to playbooks, our sustainability action tracker, for representing organizations. Join the ESG exchange. we will be sharing the how-to playbooks and giving you the opportunity to give us kind of your wiki version or your wiki responses to those playbooks as they begin to appear at our calendar year end. Do clock in for, remember, the second Thursday of each month, ESG Tech Talks, and keep an eye out for the next event in September. Thank you all for attending. God bless and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks,